Greetings. I'd like to add a word to the ever-expanding English lexicon. And honestly, if I could, I'd insert this neologism directly into dictionaries. And the word that I have in mind would be a verb. It would be either Lashawanquadashize or Lashawanquadashify, right? And that verb would refer to attempts to take the primary claim that proponents of Lashawan Qadash make for Hebrew, namely the claim that each character or each phoneme had only one vowel, an A-class vowel. The attempts to take that claim and then reapply that claim to other languages. In short, to engage in the action of this verb is to insist that yet another language other than Hebrew had only A-class vowels. In short, to Lashawanquadashify a language or Lashawanquadashize a language, that verb refers to an effort to try to make that other language like Lashawan Qadash. And I've actually encountered a few examples of this over the years, and therefore I thought it might be worthwhile to document some examples of such. You see, the first time I came across this was more than 20 years ago. I encountered a guy online, and if I recall correctly, he was with the House of David, or he might have been with that very brief 12 tribes break off from the House of David. I don't recall, but it was at the end of the very late 90s, and whatever the case, the guy was a One West influenced Israelite, and he tried to demonstrate that the Aztecs were Israelites by claiming that in both Hebrew and the Aztec language, Nahuatl, the only vowel was A. In other words, he was saying that just like Lashawan Qadash, there was no A, E, O, U vocalizations in Nahuatl. And at the time, I didn't know anything about Nahuatl, but I've since learned that the claim was plainly false.
Mashigmati na shakoyo. Kanehuatl ininansin. Ingwelneli teotl.
Now, I recently thought of that more than 20-year-old memory while perusing a thread on Facebook. It was this Facebook thread on your screen that brought that old memory back to my mind. I was looking at this thread this past weekend, and in it, the author of that thread had tagged a man who believes that the indigenous peoples of the Americas are Israelites. And relevant to that, as we're about to see, the man who was tagged also affirms a slight variation on Lashawan Qadash. Essentially, he's a proponent of Lashawan Qadash. And the post asked that man, the man who was tagged, about a statement in Nahuatl. And the man's response was initially a bit surprising. He first declared that he does not speak Germanic languages. Now, that's kind of funny as he typed that declaration in English, which is a Germanic language. But that aside, what he was hinting at there is that he's just about ready to accuse Nahuatl of being Yiddish or Yiddish influenced. But aside from that, he then wrote the following, quote, "Where did the natives of what they nowadays call the Americas learn the Greekos IEOUV Ishstein lettering system," end quote. And I hope you'll forgive the language, but the profanity aside, he was implying that Nahuatl has somehow been corrupted by the incorporation of Greek vowels, and as per the previous line, something Germanic. Now, seeing that, I left a comment noting that he's apparently trying to Lashawan Qadashize or Lashawan Qadashify the Aztec language, the indigenous Mexican language, Nahuatl. And he's taking his assumptions about Hebrew and applying them to another language from a completely different language family. And so I asked if he thinks that, Nahuatl once had only A-class vowels. But his response was basically to, ignore the question and just repeat the comment about Greek IEOU vowels, along with a bit more profanity and insults, as you can see on the screen there. And this idea that vowels that he doesn't like, that proponents of Lashawan Qadash don't like, this idea that they must come from Greek is not limited to that man. You see, a little over 5 years ago, Judah Natsara used to refer to Arabic as quote-unquote Yiddish Arabic. And he would claim that, for example, the U vocalization in Arabic must have come from the Greek upsilon. In short, he likewise seemed to be imagining a past in which Arabic was just all A-class vowels. And aside from him, still another person who does this is our beloved friend over at the We Woke Now channel, DrKellyRichardson. He claims that Ge'ez was once all A-class vowels, and thus he likes to refer to the language as Ga'az. In fact, here's a clip of the good doctor making his case for this position in one of his videos. This clip will run for a little over a minute, and fair use.
Let's deal with another language that vocalizes each consonant with without specifically marking that sound, because that is part of the delusion. that we hear that they try to interject. That, hey, you know what? The ancient Hebrews, they wrote their letters, but they didn't have to, write all the vowels out. They used vowel letters. No, they didn't. It was just an ah sound. The ancient Hebrew was unambiguous. And I'm going to prove this with, for example, Ge'ez, even though I refer to it as Ga'az. Let's deal with it. Before the 4th century, Ge'ez had not made use of vowels, but the usage of vowels was incorporated into Ge'ez when the Ashkemites converted to Christianity, which occurred sometime in the 4th century. Pankhurst suggests that the reason that the alphabet was modified at the time could have been due to the wish to make what? To make biblical texts more intelligible to the newly literate, right? Modify the language.
Okay, I'll stop that right there. First and foremost, the good doctor misunderstands the distinction between introducing symbols to represent already existing vocalizations on the one hand and introducing new vocalizations on the other. For example, in Hebrew with the Nikudot, the Masoretes introduced a system of dots and dashes to represent vocalizations that had existed for centuries. And how do we know those vocalizations existed for centuries before the Masoretes introduced the symbols, the dots and dashes? Well, we can see those vocalizations already existing in the ancient transliterations, which predate the Masoretes by centuries. Like, for example, in the New Testament, in the Septuagint, in the writings of Josephus and Philo, and even the Greek text found at Qumran and so on. So with that analogy in mind, the good doctor just assumes, when we turn to Ge'ez, the good doctor just assumes that the introduction of the derived Ge'ez letters, which have vocalizations inherent to them, he just assumes that those symbols, those characters ushered in those vocalizations. In short, he's assuming the vocalizations they represent did not exist before the introduction of the characters which represent them. He doesn't make any effort to demonstrate that, and the source that he referenced does not support his assumption in any sort of obvious way. He just sort of makes this leap in logic. But that aside, there's also a certain irony here. You see, the good doctor thinks he's being clever by calling the language Ga'az.
But they were in awe when I showed some of the letters from the Ga'az.
But even that, with all due respect to our beloved friend, even that shows a rudimentary unfamiliarity with just even the basics of the subject. So on your screen is a chart of the Ge'ez letters and this chart is from the 16th century. And I wanted to use this chart because of the headings for each column. You see, in the first column on the left, you have the Ge'ez form, which is to say the free form, the form which the other forms are derived from, right? And then after that, you have the columns marked Ka'ib, Salis, Irabit, Hamis, Sadis, Sabit, right? Which is to say second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh, right? The second through seventh forms, right? And you can find the different letter forms being described basically like that to this day. Where, like, for example, in this Facebook post you see on your screen, where after the Ge'ez form or the free form, you have, again, the forms being called Ka'ib, Salis, Rabi, and, etc., right? Basically second, third, fourth, and so on, right? Now, having said that, I want to focus on that sixth column, or the column for the sixth form, among these derived forms. You see, this is the unvocalized form, where the character represents a phoneme that often does not have a vowel, right? So the name of the language, Ge'ez, is spelled with 3 letters from that form. Every single letter is from that sixth or largely unvocalized form, right? Now let's keep that in mind. Now Kelly's name for the language, Ga'az, would presumably be spelled like this, with the first 2 characters being derived forms for the longer A-class vowel, not the short A-class vowel that's represented by the Ge'ez form or the free form, but rather the longer A-class vowel, hence Ga'az. And then the last character would be from that sixth form, which comes to a stop, right? It's the unvocalized form. Now, maybe one might want to say we're splitting hairs with those first 2 characters, so we can render them in that first form, the free form, and then we get Ga'az, right? But the good doctor unambiguously put a stop on that last phoneme. So a derived character from that sixth form remains for his pronunciation. If he wanted the name of the language to be spelled with only letters from that first form, the free form, the Ge'ez form, the underived form, it would not be Ga'az, right? Rather, it would be Ga'aza. And interestingly enough, this is even a problem with the good doctor's approach to Hebrew, right? He inserts all sorts of stops into his pronunciation of Hebrew words, not realizing that such a stop is itself a vocalization choice.
Want to say peace and blessings to everyone. Want to say shalom, lak, mash, paka.
Now, although he rejects the Masoretic diacritics, and thus he rejects the schwa, those two vertical dots which would represent that sort of a stop, he replaces it with Ariya's diacritic, right? He'll literally write in that little smiley face sort of curve, which Ariya called the connector, right? And that goes back to 1 West. That's a 1 West diacritic. It's far more modern than the Masoretic Nikudot, right? Ariya's diacritics are like a full millennium later than the Masoretic dots and dashes, the Nikudot, or just Nikud as people call them, right? And you can see more on that in my video on Lashawan Qadash Diacritics, which I'll put in the video description. But with that, I'm going to stop this video here, right? I mainly just wanted to document a few different instances of proponents of Lashawan Qadash trying to Lashawanquadashify other languages. In other words, just as they've tried to reduce Hebrew to A-class vowels, some of them are trying to do the same with other languages, such as Arabic, Ge'ez, and perhaps most absurdly, Nahuatl, right? And on that note, I look forward to any comments, questions, or criticisms. I don't censor anyone here, so feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. And God bless.